Welcome, Trojans. I'm Sarah Sturm, Senior Executive Director of Alumni Relations at USC Dornsife. Thanks for joining us for today's Dornsife Dialogue. If you're watching on Zoom, you're welcome to submit a question at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have to leave today's discussion at any point or you want to listen or watch again, it will be on our Dornsife Dialogues podcast, available on all of your favorite podcast platforms, and a link to the video will be on the Dornsife Dialogues section of our website. Make sure to follow USC Dornsife on all social channels. Our handle is at USC Dornsife. Now I'll turn it over to the Dean of the USC Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, Amber Miller.
Welcome to Dornsife Dialogues. It's hard to believe, but the next presidential election cycle is already just around the corner. And all of us political junkies are anxiously watching to see how the shifting landscape will impact the campaigns. One interesting development is that America's fastest growing political party isn't Democrats or Republicans. It's those who identify with neither one. 20 years ago, fewer than a third of respondents identified as independents. But a recent Gallup poll found that today, 49% of Americans do. So today's panel will help us make sense of who these voters are, what they want, and how they are shaking up our two-party system. Our conversation will be moderated by Bob Schrum and Mike Murphy, co-directors of the USC Dornsife Center for the Political Future. Bob is the Carmen and Lois Warshaw Chair in Practical Politics. He is among the most sought-after Democratic political strategists in the nation, with an unparalleled record of consulting for high-level campaigns and administrations, including John Kerry's campaign in 2004 and Al Gore's 2000 race for the White House. Mike is a conservative political media consultant, a longtime senior analyst for NBC News and MSNBC, and has served as a top campaign advisor to John McCain, Mitt Romney, Jeb Bush, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, along with dozens of other GOP senators, governors, and members of Congress. Today, they have been working to change the way we talk to each other across the aisle, focusing on civil debate, policy solutions, and new ideas. So I'll now pass it off to Mike and Bob, who will introduce our terrific group of panelists. Thank you again for joining us and enjoy the conversation.
Good afternoon. Mike and I welcome you to this latest Dornsife Dialogue, where, as the Dean just noted, we will discuss the rise of the independent voters. Mike and I will lead this discussion for about 40 minutes and then turn to questions from the audience. As Sarah said earlier, please enter your questions in the Q&A feature on Zoom. We have a terrific panel with us today. Arnon Mishkin is the groundbreaking guru in charge of calling elections at Fox News as director of its decision desk. His team famously called Biden for Arizona in the 2020 election, and we are proud to say he joined us as a fall 2023 fellow at the center. Lisa D.T. Rice is a political strategist, keynote speaker, and author. She is leading a major effort to bring more open primaries and ranked choice voting to the nation's capital. Sara Sadhwani is assistant professor of politics at Pomona College, co-host of the Inside the Issues podcast with Alex Cohen. She is a scholar who focuses on elections, and she served as a commissioner on the 2020 California Citizens Redistricting Commission, redrawing district lines for Congress, the state legislature, and the Board of Equalization. Let me kick off this session with this question. Why are more voters identifying as independent than Republican or Democratic? What's caused the increasing disillusionment with the major parties? Arnon, if you want to start, that's fine.
Oh, starting with the easy ones first. I think it's a really good question. I don't think there is a straightforward answer to it. I think it's two things. First of all, I think that there is, as the parties grew very, very powerful, and as the reputation of parties and party bosses grew powerful, there became a social value in saying, I'm actually not beholden to any specific party. I am beholden to my own thoughts, and I evaluate each character, the character of each candidate, based on their positions on the issues and whatever else goes into that thing, which I think there's a social value to it. The second one that I think is actually probably more relevant is, I think one of the reasons that independent voters have grown is because, and it's an important reason, and I think a reason worth discussing, is that neither party has presented a platform or a vision of who they are that is congruent with large numbers of people. And I think if you think about American politics, I think to a great extent it was defined, that modern American politics has been defined by sort of Ronald Reagan, or your views of Ronald Reagan and the Ronald Reagan sets of issues that arguably are what made the Republican Party sort of a dominant force in American politics, starting 43 years ago. And that was balance the budget, have a strong defense and a strong international position, a very conservative positions on social issues, and lower taxes. And that appealed to a large group of Americans, and they saw that, even though they may have, there were many sort of Republicans who were kind of pro-choice, they nonetheless felt comfortable with that positioning and with hanging out with those kinds of people. And I think on the Democratic side, people who sort of came, even though they may have disagreed with some positions on the anti-side of that, I think they were very comfortable with that. I think a lot of that has been redefined. It's been redefined by young people. It's been redefined by Donald Trump and others. And so where, a few years ago, we thought of the perfect candidate as being someone who was sort of liberal on social issues and conservative on economic issues. And that was the candidacy that Mike Bloomberg designed an independent campaign around, planning for 2016 and the rest. That's been turned on its head. And one of the things Donald Trump has shown is that actually people that the appeal is for a candidate who basically says, I'm going to support all entitlements and I'll be conservative on, the exact opposite of that. He was conservative on many social issues, or so he campaigned. And he developed an enormous populist view of that. So I think one of the things is, I think that neither party has figured out where the bulk of voters really are, particularly where the bulk of young voters are. And I think that, one of the things I tried to talk in my the Dornsife Center study group that I had, and I must say I was really impressed with the students I dealt with, was the idea that, remember, the goal of a political party is to win elections, and the goal of a candidate is to figure out, how do I position myself? And this will sound cynical, and it's not meant cynically, but it's worth sort of thinking about what the goal of a candidate is. How do I form positions that will get me the majority of the votes, or enough votes to win an election? And I think neither party has figured out what that right position is for the future as of now. And I think that's one of the reasons you see a lot of candidates, a lot of voters identifying themselves as independent.
Lisa, and then Sarah.
Well, I think that voters are really disenchanted with the candidates that are being offered by the Republican and Democratic parties, especially at the federal level. A large number of people, I think it's about 72%, have an unfavorable view of Congress and who's in Congress, people who identify themselves as Republicans or Democrats. And so more than half of voters even have an unfavorable view of the president. And so I think that saying I'm independent rather than aligning myself with these R's or D's gives people a more bold way to walk into this abyss that they feel that we're facing. I mean, gosh, so many people disenchanted with Congress, and how do I separate myself from that disenchantment? Declaring myself an independent is one way to do that. And I think that's a lot of what's going on as well.
Sarah?
Yeah, and I so appreciate the comments of both Lisa and Arnon. I completely agree, actually, with all of what they've said. But as the political scientist on the panel, I would be remiss to not talk about who are we actually talking about when we say independence. And when pollsters go out to ask people which party they identify, which candidate they're going to support, more and more often we're hearing 45% of respondents saying that they identify as independents. Dean Miller, of course, pointing to 49% in that recent Gallup poll, which is an astronomical number. And we've been seeing that rise over time. That being said, the typical follow-up question to that is there a party that you usually identify with or lean towards? So in political science, we often refer to many independents as leaners. And so while there are more and more people identifying as independents, typically 80 or 85% of those people actually identify with one of the two parties and will typically support a specific party and specific kinds of candidates again and again. So when we're talking about these independents, yeah, there are folks that aren't necessarily going to fly the flag of either the Democrats or the Republicans. They might not be putting out yard signs per se, but they have a preference at the ballot box, even though they might have some questions about it. Maybe they don't agree with everything that they say. And I wanted to pick up particularly on one thread that Arnon raised around social values. And I think that's right. When we look at the American populace, we certainly have large proportion, well, actually small proportions of folks who are actively involved in the political process, who are engaged in Twitter debates, who are reading the news and really engaged and informed. The vast majority of the American populace, however, including even folks who are registered to vote and plan to vote in a presidential election, don't necessarily weigh in on political debates. The vast majority of people are concerned about paying their bills, making sure their kids go off to school, that their families are cared for. And so when they turn on the TV and see all of the vitriol in Congress, seeing the arguments between Democrats and Republicans, and even intra-party debates, they say that's not me. And it's easier, I think, for many people today to identify as an independent because at the end of the day, they want to be able to get along with their neighbor. They don't want to have fights on the next door app in their neighborhood. And I think that's a big piece that's pushing people to identify as independents. But at the end of the day, most of those independents do have political preferences.
Mike, you want to pick this up?
Yeah, thank you, Bob, and welcome everybody to the conversation. Yeah, I totally agree with Sarah. It's interesting. Independents are somewhat misnamed because they're really Republicans and Democrats who don't admit they're Republicans or Democrats out of embarrassment or that social value of saying, I'm too smart to fall into a trap. There's an old joke in market research about the consumer at the supermarket, and the market researcher stops the consumer and said, "Excuse me, I notice you've just bought Crest toothpaste. Is that because of our new advertising campaign?" And the consumer gets indignant and says, "No, I'm not manipulated by your stupid advertising campaign. I don't fall for your jingle or the talking puppy or any of those ads. I'm not that stupid. I make my own decisions. I'm not steered by marketing. I choose to buy Crest toothpaste because I want to get 23% fewer cavities with MFP fluoride." So what often disappoints people is they say, wait a minute, we got 47% or whatever in data, over 40 in a lot of places, say we're independent. So if we run an independent candidate, we get 47% of the vote. But most independents, when faced with an independent candidate, the vote support drops a little. You put independent voters in one room, they will start fighting over issues. And you find out a lot of them are more left of center and generally vote Democratic or Republican. So the independent movie is more a rejection, the independent identification is more a rejection of party brands. But as Sarah says, not so much in behavior, because they can't often agree, and this is a problem third parties have, on what they're supposed to be for. Are they pro-choice? Are they pro-life? Gun control, taxes, more government? All the old stuff comes back into play, though I think Arnon is right, that's reformulating now going forward to kind of populism versus not populism. So, in a campaign, you tend to get your base voters and then figure out the dog whistles to get the independents who are kind of leaning your way to get a permission structure to come along and get over the obstacle in their head that makes them not want to admit that I'm a Republican or a Democrat. So they've got a lot of power, but they're not a homogenous block. And I think sometimes people get confused about that. Anyway, let me ask the next question, because it's clearly it's clearly growing. So, I'll ask the panel here, with all the polarization in American politics, the stress over October 7th, January 7th, and the insurrection, and of course now a war that's becoming more, sorry, a long night, and the current stress over, especially in the Democratic Party, on the war in Gaza. Do we expect, now that we're into the theory of large numbers with mid-40s independents, it to keep climbing? Or do we think maybe it's bottomed out a little bit? Because politics as a brand is under such pressure now. What do we think the future holds? And will we ever see a third-party candidate get over these obstacles and maybe be able to get in, we'll talk Electoral College in a minute, be able to get to a majority of the vote? So Lisa, why don't we start with you?
Well, yeah, you hit on one thing that's really important for us to remember, and that is independents aren't a monolith. And so it's not as if, and I am an independent, I'm registered here in Washington, D.C. as a non-affiliated voter. We aren't a monolith. And so it's not as if we've joined an independent party. It's not as if we've joined a third party. We are, someone mentioned rejecting those brands. But I don't see any reason that the slice of independence wouldn't grow. We are dissatisfied with the way our elections are run. We are dissatisfied with the candidates that are being offered. I would say that most of us are not necessarily closeted Republicans or Democrats, though some of us, most of us, many of us will vote in the presidential election, which will have two candidates. And so, I'm not going to be naive and say that, I'm not going to vote for someone that carries an R or D label. I certainly will. But yeah, I don't think we are at a point where the growth of independence is plateauing at all. I think the trend will continue to go up.
Sarah, what do you think?
It certainly seems to be the ongoing trend to continue going up, but at some point we continue to have this two-party system. And I think as there's a couple different pieces to this, right? So there's younger voters who are coming into this system, who are disillusioned for a whole host of reasons, who might be identifying as independents. We can talk about young voters in particular, who more and more of them are identifying as independents, many of them being people of color in particular. And then there might be older cohorts of voters over the age of 30 or over the age of 45 or 50 who are leaving the party structure. And I think those are two distinctions that we might want to make. Those younger voters might eventually help transform the two parties that we know of and are speaking of today, whereas the older voters might just be more disillusioned and may never come back to the party. So it's entirely possible to continue to see this increasing trend. Arnon pointed out in the very beginning, however, that there's a renegotiation of what these parties really are going to stand for in the future. And I'm really curious about the role that younger voters are going to play in that, and whether or not they'll continue to see themselves as independents as they see American politics transform over the next 10, 15, 20 years.
Arnon, do you think we're going to see in the near future majority identification, as independents? And will that be a watershed that changes anything, or just the current trends of independent voters kind of splitting one way or the other, with the minority of that clump being ticket splitters, true ticket splitters, continue? Or do you think once it's majority independent, something will really happen, material change?
I think as long as we have a executive branch the way we have it set up in the US today, there will be a choice that voters will have to make, as Lisa talked about earlier, that they will have to make. Do you want candidate R or candidate D? And maybe they'll change their names, but it'll come down to two people. Which of these two people do you feel should serve as the executive, which is, let's face it, in the US, a fairly strong constitutional system, as opposed to what you see in parliamentary systems, where there's all sorts of minor parties that get traction, and wind up electing representatives into a parliament, who then choose a prime minister, and in that negotiation takes place after the election of sort of, okay, which person do you really want to settle on in the end as a prime minister, as opposed to a campaign deciding that election. I also think, and you mentioned a number of incidents. I think one of the things that I think is really interesting going on today, and I think it's going to affect the independent voter, is that there's a whole heck of a lot of stuff going on in the world today. You mentioned the Middle East. We saw the meeting between Xi and Biden yesterday over what the role of Asia is going to be, and the role of China, and the tension between the U.S. and China. We obviously have been living with the war in Ukraine, which is very important, and we have an economy that is at best iffy right now, or we don't know. And I think that the thing about those four sort of centers of important news is that Joe Biden's fingerprints are all over all of them. And I think and don't ask me how they're going to turn out, because I'm not an expert on any of those four issues. I am an expert on something about politics, and I would argue that how those situations develop over the next 6 months will cause voters who may right now think Joe Biden is doing a great job or doing a horrible job on any of those four things to say, I never thought that. I've always thought he was doing a horrible job, or always thought he was doing a great job. And I think that's going to have a profound impact on the results of the election, and the result on their self-identification. Do I feel comfortable being with this guy who is the face of D, or do I not?
Right. No, I think you're right. It could be a change up. Bob?
Listening to all of you, I sense a skepticism about the possibility that the U.S. could ever have a competitive multi-party system. And I wonder, what role does the Electoral College play in entrenching this two-party dominance? Sarah, you want to start?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is like poli-sci 101. My students love to take on questions about the Electoral College, and oftentimes it's a question of whether or not this is a fair system, because of course in recent times we've seen the Electoral College produce a result that runs counter to the popular vote. And so certainly I have a lot of college students who love to take on the question of the Electoral College. In terms of multi-parties, I mean, ultimately the key component for the Electoral College, however, is that it's a winner-take-all system for most states. States will determine how the electoral votes are going to be determined, and the vast majority of the states across the country use this winner-take-all system, which leads itself to this two-party system. Is it likely to see a transformation of the Electoral College in my lifetime? That seems like a long shot. Any amendments to the Constitution feel like quite far away, especially in this Congress that struggles to really get anything done. To see a huge constitutional transformation like that feels far away. That being said, I think there's a lot of different kinds of reforms and electoral reforms that are happening at local levels, which look really promising for thinking about multi-party systems in other venues. But I'm so curious. I know Lisa does a lot more work in this arena, to hear some of her thoughts on this issue.
I was just going to turn to Lisa and ask her about open primaries, ranked choice voting, how that will impact the electorate, where you have more and more voters identifying as independents. And will those political reforms, if we achieve them, strengthen our democracy?
I believe so. I think the reforms would absolutely strengthen our democracy. You talk about how many millions of voters are disenfranchised in our current system, in these safe seat districts. If you're anything other than majority, your voice doesn't matter. There are more than 70 million voters who live in districts that are considered safe seats for the party they oppose. Open primaries, or better yet, nonpartisan primaries, would give about 30 million registered voters who were unable to cast a meaningful vote in 2022 primary elections for U.S. House. That would give them a say in who they want representing them and would bring competition to those safe seat districts. Ranked choice voting, as we know, would empower every voter, independents, Republicans, Democrats, and whatever other parties they identify with, to support the candidates they think would represent them best, while also ranking their choices, their second, third, and fourth choices. And so, ranked choice voting is definitely a way for us to ensure that a candidate is receiving a true majority of the votes. And at the end of the day, that's what we really want. I will not wax on about what I'm doing here in DC, but I will say that I would love to see people that are representing me on the city council have been elected by a majority of the voters. And right now, that's not happening.
Arnon, what do you think the prospects are that we'll see a spread of ranked choice voting and of nonpartisan primaries?
I'm not a political scientist. I'll leave. I do know that ranked choice voting has some dissenting views because of the nature, and I think that if you saw the New York primary for mayor, which was a ranked choice primary process, and you can, that there were too many candidates that people didn't know much about, who wound up sort of getting a number of second choice votes or third choice votes, and candidates that were sort of more, sort of had more of a persona didn't get that many second and third choice votes. And I think there was some people who think that the results were not, that in a different sort of situation where you had a series of runoffs or, open primaries, nonpartisan primaries would have had a direct Maya Wiley, Eric Adams race might have turned out differently than the way it turned out. And so people might have been happy. That was one thought. But I do feel very strongly that one of that open primary, the way we've developed our primary system, together with the way we vote, choose districts, gives disproportionate power to the sort of wings of different parties, who are the ones who participate in the primaries and the like. And you don't need any better example than Ohio, where the legislature is a fairly gerrymandered legislature. They voted very clearly for very strict abortion restrictions, and that was not at all representative of what the voters in Ohio want. And because we saw the results of the constitutional amendment most recently. So I'm a very strong proponent of the idea that open primaries and some way of addressing the issue of gerrymandering is very important in terms of developing a government that is representative of the voters.
Linda, you want to defend ranked choice voting?
Lisa?
Yeah,
Lisa, I'm sorry.
yes,
Excuse
yeah.
me.
But Linda might want to too. Look, I will defend ranked choice voting, but I want to talk a little bit about what Arnon touched on, and that is the power of the extremes voting in these extremely gerrymandered districts. Look, there is no single electoral reform that will solve all of our problems, but I do believe that one of the most powerful would be independent redistricting. And that would help us so much because, right now, in an extraordinarily gerrymandered district, you have so few people who will determine who's going to the general election. I don't know that ranked choice voting is the end all and be all, but we do see that it helps. And we also see that enfranchising as many voters as possible also helps. Now, if we enfranchise, and I will use DC as an example, we have 86,000 voters who are registered as independent, 1 in 6 of us. I am one of those. I would love to have the chance to vote in the primaries here, right? As an independent. I don't want to choose a party. But just because that happens doesn't mean all of a sudden every independent is going to show up to vote. So we can only cure so many things with each reform, but I think we want to keep trying. You know, I want to keep trying. I don't want to accept the status quo. And so that's why we do what we do. And that's why the political scientists help us figure out what's going to help us cure certain ills. So I'm all for reforms. And if it doesn't work, we'll try something else. We can't accept the status quo.
Thank you, Lisa. Mike.
Yeah, no, I'll just do that one more question, and then we'll get to your questions out there. You can put them in the chat here, and we're looking forward to them. I'm for ranked choice voting because I like the incentives in it. But the argument for open primaries is almost undeniable. I mean, forget the nomenclature, if independents in their actions almost always wind up voting Republican and Democrat, I'd almost rather call them casual Republicans and casual Democrats. And the idea that a casual Republican cannot vote in a Republican primary, somebody who habitually most of the time votes Republican, or a casual Democrat cannot vote in a Democrat primary is crazy. And it's in the party's interest because the more you widen the primary electorate to look like a general election electorate, the more you're incentivized to let the most competitive and attractive and effective candidate win. So it's generally only party organizations that want to narrow it down to a controllable universe. And I agree with Lisa that redistricting reform is so key. I used to live in California in a district that I think Bob drew years ago that is only contiguous at low tide. So we did it on the Republican Party too. In Michigan, we were always irritated by a very effective Democratic Congressman, Sandy Levin, and we kept trying to figure out how to draw him into Ontario, Canada, but never quite figured out how to do it. So redistricting is a partisan sport of politicians, and it does not do good stuff. So big final question. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just loving all of this support for independent redistricting commissions, which I happen to serve on for the state of California. I wasn't expecting that necessarily from this group, so I just wanted to chime in and share, you know, the process here in California is really the gold standard. We were very excited because, I mean, when we talk about independence, and I think oftentimes that lends itself to questions of bipartisanship. It was a 15-member panel that voted unanimously to support the maps that we drew for the state of California, with not a single lawsuit brought against our map, something that we are very proud of.
Yeah, and that is rare. It is a trickier thing to do than people think. I think Iowa has an extremely good model too, because often civil rights issues bump into it based on the type of districts you're drawing. The dimension is not just partisan, it's also geographic, and Voting Rights Act gets involved. So it's more complicated and harder to do than people think. But anyway, to keep us moving, we independent candidacies, as we've discussed, you know, at least in the near term, don't have much of a chance, electoral college and other reasons, to actually win. But they sure can be a catalyst. And right now, I guarantee you over at Biden headquarters, they're looking at some of the independent candidates who are running, worrying they could be a spoiler. And over in Trump land, I'm sure they're thinking some of the same things. You're looking at Robert Kennedy Jr., who was in the Democratic primary, now running as an independent on kind of a alienated younger voter appeal and vaccine skepticism and other stuff, but a famous enough name, he can prize some attention. Cornel West, who's been a powerful public intellectual in the African-American space and beyond, is running. I guess Jill Stein, who seems to run for a living, is now running. What do we think will happen there? And could one of them or all of them be a material issue in the general election in a potential contest between Joe Biden and Donald Trump? And, you know, if they come to life, who benefits, who loses? And I'll start with Arnon on this.
Okay, so my view of the election, the 2024 election, assuming Trump is the Republican nominee, which I'm pretty sure of, but I don't think I'm not giving anyone a money back guarantee on that.
I agree, not sure.
But Donald Trump is an individual that, for whatever a candidate who has, as they say, a very high floor and a pretty low ceiling. That is to say, that what people think of Donald Trump in November 2023, I guarantee you, and I think regardless of what happens in the court cases or whatever tweets he sends out or truths, they're going to think the same thing about him in October of 2024. And people who think that disruptor is a good thing and something America needs, there'll be a group of that, and there'll be a lot of people who think he's a disruptor, and I don't like him. Joe Biden, I think, has a very, let's face it, he's one of the beigest politicians around right now, and people, even though they made whatever, the views of Joe Biden can change. The implication, now what's the implication of that on the perspective of third-party candidates? It means that whoever's running is most likely not going to take votes away from Donald Trump, but they could be voters who might otherwise be voting for Joe Biden, would be available to Joe Biden. So I think, without naming names, most of them would probably be harmful to Biden, will be harmful to Biden. The one exception may be Bobby Kennedy Jr., who may go get some of those, the traditional, if you think about it, the Kennedy mantra, the Kennedy base has always been the sort of white working class, much of the white working class that goes for Donald Trump. So and the vaccine skepticism and some of the other sort of anti-corporate stuff that, believe it or not, Bobby Kennedy Jr. Represents, and is also the space that Trump represents. So it's possible, and you see it in some of the data, some signs that he's takes some votes away from Trump.
Lisa, what do you think?
Look, I'm going to say that I'm going to flip the premise of the question and really talk about the real spoiler, which is our broken election system. And it's continuing to promote dysfunction, division, disappointment. I read a recent New York Times Siena College poll that a fifth of voters in the battleground states didn't like Trump or Biden as a candidate. Voters want choices. So I would love to see ranked choice voting. Voters wouldn't have to worry about the implications of voting for a third-party candidate whom they prefer. They, vote for their favorite, rank the others, and see where it comes out. There is one thing about these third-party candidates that we don't talk about much, and that is what would get someone's attention, and we don't even get to hear what they have to say. So I have never voted for a third-party candidate, so that tells you right there I vote one way or the other. But I certainly would like to hear what they have to say, because I think they would drive some issues and drive the two dominant candidates to pick up some issues that voters who are sort of not quite decided, and drive issues and make those two candidates look at, do I want to adopt this issue? And I'm thinking of Kennedy, who actually pulled something from his platform that I didn't even know he wanted to do, and now it's been pulled from his platform. So, poor us not being able to hear everything that the man wanted to say.
Sara, what do you think about this world of potential spoiler independence with our disaffected electorate? And what do you think the material impact will be in the end? Will there be a key swing state in the Electoral College where maybe a 5% vote could make a difference and affect the entire election?
Yeah, RFK, I think, should be worrisome for the Biden campaign in that regard. He could be potentially worrisome to a Trump campaign as well. He seems to be pulling kind of the extremes of both the left and the right, which is this very interesting assortment of support that he seems to be receiving from the anti-vaxxing crowd to Hollywood elites who have been supporting him because he has those long relationships there. I think in particular what's interesting to me is a recent Quinnipiac University poll finding Kennedy earning 22% of support amongst registered voters. That is a very high number. The last independent presidential candidate to earn over 20% in such a poll was actually Ross Perot back in 1992, and he most certainly had an impact on the campaign, and he ended up getting nearly 19% of the eventual vote. So I think candidates would be wise to be paying attention to RFK in particular. We would be foolish to overlook the possible impact of him and of this candidacy. That's not to suggest that he has any chance of winning, but certainly, as you mentioned, when it comes to these key swing states, any shift towards a candidate like this could have detrimental impacts for either of the two major party candidates. If we recall, Georgia in 2020, Biden won that by just a handful, 12,000 votes in that state. Of course, Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, the Rust Belt states, of course, also being important places where we're going to have to be paying close attention. We'll need to really see what impact RFK is able to have in those swing states.
You know, there's been an interesting phenomenon with RFK, and I'm curious what Bob thinks, and then we can maybe go to questions. In New Hampshire, he started out well in polls because his last name is a great political asset, but the more he campaigned, the worse he did, to the point where, you know, he's now moved to the independent thing. I would not be surprised, and I'm not a fan, to see that same situation. The more the definition is who he is rather than, oh, that name, he must be a good guy. I think he'll decline, but even down at 4 or 5%, he could be material. Bob, what do you think about that as somebody who knows something about the Kennedy brand? And then maybe you'll take us into the audience questions, which are piling up in the chat room, which is good news.
Yeah, I'll be very fast because I want to get to the audience questions. Look, most of his own family isn't for him. I think as people hear him talk and go on and on, for example, about vaccines and Dr. Fauci and Bill Gates are in a conspiracy to make money by, you know, telling people they need to get vaccinated. I think the more that happens, the less appeal that he will have. But it's a painful memory for me. I mean, Ralph Nader didn't get that many votes in 2000, but if he hadn't been on the ballot, we wouldn't have even had a dispute about Florida. Gore simply would have been elected president. So he can have a big impact. Let me turn to Mike. Why don't we alternate asking these questions? So I'll go first. Glenn asks, how widespread is the perception by voters that both major political parties care more about raising money from special interest donors rather than caring about the average American? Who wants to start with that? Oh, okay, Lisa, go.
I was about to say perception is reality, right? A lot of people believe that. I don't have the stats at the ready, but it does seem to be all about the money, and it is incredibly expensive. Dr. Sadhwani, do you know the numbers on that? I don't know how much it costs to run a presidential race these days.
Oh, it's enormous to do a presidential race as well as congressional races as well. I don't have any specific stats in terms of perceptions, in terms of time spent raising money, but just from research, even with local candidates, I mean, they have to spend so much of their time doing call time, knocking on doors to not only garner support, but also to fundraise. This is absolutely the reality of American politics today. And certainly there are also, we've been talking a lot about reforms. There are reforms that have been discussed at local levels, at state levels, to try and take more of the money out of politics. But really living in this post-Citizens United world, the influence of money in politics is enormous. It is absolutely enormous. I think so. The campaign strategists might know even better than I would, just how much time candidates must really be spending actually going out and doing that fundraising work.
Can I take a slightly contrarian view on this? Because I agree. It is a mantra, the special interest money and the like. And I do agree that Citizens United has had a serious impact on the sort of dialogue and the ability of people with wealth to try to influence elections. But I also think that there's this other thing that's happened in terms of raising money, which is that, and I think it started out on the right, but it's very much on the left as well, which is sort of small dollar amounts, and the ability of candidates to take very sort of positions that are that represent the views of a very small contingent of Americans, and take very extreme positions that the bulk of Americans might think is not a good idea, and make it an issue because they're able to raise so much money out of it. I mean, and you see that on both sides of the aisle. And I think so. It's not just special interest money; it's also small donor money that has sort of sent candidates into the more extreme direction in order to raise money. But I agree that it is a huge problem. Sort of, I think it very much costs north of $1 billion to run for president successfully, and you're going to have to figure out a way to raise that money somehow.
Mike?
I had my thing was stuck on off. I've been muted. Something new to me. Yeah, and I agree. The perception, which is the reality in politics, is all about money. Often it's about a lot more things, even psychosis. But that's another panel. So this is an interesting question. It's unnamed, but I think it's a smart one. Traditionally, it seems that independents were more likely to be associated with moderate factions of either major party. Do you have evidence to support that has shifted and now represents a greater spectrum of political ideology? After the progressive movement associated with Bernie Sanders, it seemed that a shift may be occurring. And I just say historically, that association is not always true. George Wallace ran as a populist independent. On the other hand, John Anderson had a fairly muscular independent campaign in 1980 as kind of a wine and cheese, more liberal Republican. So I'm not sure there's one rule on that, but let's go to our political scientist, and I'll start with Sara.
Yeah, I think this is such a great question. And I don't have one specific answer, because I think we're still digging into this enormous rise of people identifying as independents, but in particular, to the extent that the question mentions Bernie Sanders, I think it's important to be thinking about younger voters. And I mentioned this briefly earlier. Younger voters in particular are now more likely to identify as independent or unaffiliated with a political party. There was a Harvard youth poll that was conducted earlier this year, and it really showed this striking shift. And we have to remember, when we're talking about a younger generation that's under the age of 30, we're talking about a cohort of voters who are not necessarily majority white. We're talking about a surge of Latino voters, of Asian American voters, who are not identifying with either the Democratic or Republican Party brand. And I think, speaking to this shift that we've been talking about this entire time, it's amongst these younger voters that we see this shift. Their big four, if you will, of issues include climate change, gun violence, economic inequality, and LGBTQ+ rights. These are not issues that the major parties are necessarily taking on in any big ways. So it's not surprising that younger voters are going to feel disenfranchised by the parties. And this is going to be exacerbated. It's being exacerbated right now on college campuses, as we see just a flurry of protests around the Israel-Gaza war. I'm so curious how that's going to continue to play out over the coming months as we sort of barrel towards the 2024 election. Ultimately, this is a generation of folks who grew up not necessarily during the Obama presidency. They were young folks during that time period. But instead, the pieces that really mark their lives is COVID-19, the fight for Black lives and Black Lives Matter. Now this Gaza war, it is a generation that has never felt secure, either in terms of being in their classrooms or for their financial futures. And I think that this kind of momentum of younger voters will eventually be a big part of this transformation in American politics.
Bob?
I'm going to combine two questions here. Why is it that some states have open nonpartisan primaries that are Democratic, and then other Democratic states have closed primaries? Same thing goes with the Republicans. And I want to combine that with another question that's been asked. Won't nonpartisan or jungle primaries, won't they create a situation in which the voice of the minority can often not be heard because no minority candidate advances to the general election? So in California in 2016, we had 2 Democrats running for the Senate. Who would like to? Lisa, you want to defend the open primaries again?
Hey, why not? Actually, we'd love, I think the wonderful model would be fully open primaries. A nonpartisan primary would be great. I think we have to deal with wherever we are in whatever state or whatever region or whatever city we're in. And in places where either party has a supermajority hold, what those independents want is just to be able to vote in what some call a semi-closed or a semi-open primary. So in other words, on primary day, let me, the independent voter, choose someone's ballot to vote on. And I believe, Mike, that would be an instance of us showing where we're casual, right? because we're casual whatevers, and we choose that. We want to be able to have a say in the primaries because that's where those decisions are made. The general elections in many cases don't mean much. So that's my start on it. I would love to see primaries open up, and especially if they're taxpayer funded. Look, if the supermajority here in Washington, D.C., my hometown, if they want to take their primary private and not have taxpayers funded, then go ahead, have a caucus, and I won't participate. But while I'm paying for it, I'd like to be able to participate.
The jungle primary calculation is interesting here in California with our Senate race because, there are 2 outcomes. One is a Democrat and a Republican. Republican will lose. It's an overwhelmingly Democratic state, or 2 Democrats. So both of the major candidates in the primary now are trying to do that calculation. In the old days, you try to out-base group your opponent and get the Democratic nomination. What the jungle primary has done is opened up the second place Democratic challenger, if they can edge out the Republican, to have ideological room to move to the center and try to attract more centrist voters, including Republicans. So it is not, the question is pretty good. Isn't a jungle primary an opportunity for one party to dominate? Yes, but within the parties, it creates a lot more ideological room for a coalition candidate who's not just a base candidate, which I think is a good thing. All right, let's go to the horse race here. We can't resist one of these things. There was some big news made in Washington that Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia had announced, and it was expected, and this is a question from Ben, was not going to run for re-election. He's got a very popular Republican governor, Jim Justice, who has probably America's most popular bulldog always around him, running against him. So he's going on a national listening tour, and he hasn't admitted as much, but all but one thing he's listening for is people to tell him to run for president as an independent. Do we think he's going to run, and would he have a chance? We'll go to Aaron.
I mean, I have no idea what's going on in his head and whether or not he'll choose to run. I think I'd argue he doesn't. I don't have enormous confidence in the polling for the reasons that Sarah explained earlier about how third-party candidates tend to sink. And if you look at the third-party candidates who've gained real traction, it was George Wallace in my lifetime. And George Wallace represented an extreme that had a very solid base of support for that. And Manchin, I think a lot of people kind of like him. I would argue that the way he handled himself in DC during Joe Biden's first 2 years helped Joe Biden in terms of expanding the support to the sort of middle. But I don't see someone like that from whose basic position is I'm in the center as being something that's going to attract the people to sort of even casual Dems or casual Republicans to move away, which is very much what George Wallace did, and arguably what George Wallace did was create the modern Republican Party when he took all those voters who were always Democratic and made them start to vote for someone else and wound up in Richard Nixon's camp.
Anyone else want to weigh in on the independent potential candidate of Senator Joe Manchin?
I will jump in. I mean, I agree with Arnon on this piece. I would be very surprised to see him try and run as a presidential candidate. But look, there are politicians who are out there clearly running for something, even if they're not running for president. We might even look to here in California at our governor, who is constantly, attempting to get on the national news. What is it that they're actually jockeying for, right? Is it to be a vice presidential pick? Is it to be have a cabinet post perhaps, or some juicy ambassadorship? I think there's a lot of potential options that folks might go on such a listening tour or engage in debates that they don't necessarily need to be engaging in order to continue to raise their profile, certainly towards something. Hey, maybe it's towards just a big book deal that they could get to write their story and live off their days on their riverboat. I think it was, right? Doesn't he have a riverboat?
Yeah, he's got a houseboat in DC that is the secret meeting place of kind of a bipartisan group, Mitt Romney and others, who have been very effective in the Senate as a centrist bloc. But whether or not that's the winning general election independent message for Michigan, hey, in my houseboat, we move cloture on an amendment that, I like Manchin. I'm an admirer, but I think he will not be able to get arrested as an independent candidate. All right. I think we have time for Bob to decide, wrapping up, or one more quick question. We have about 4 minutes left.
Okay.
To pull the plug.
Yeah. This question says, Trump will at some point lose his grip on the Republican Party. Mike, of course, hopes that's sooner rather than later.
Tomorrow.
Whether he loses in 2024 or one day serves as president again, he's gone after that. When that happens, do you think there'll be a crisis of identity in the Republican Party that will see the Trump MAGA movement sort of dominating one part of it and other people saying, I can't live with this anymore, and becoming independents who lean Republican or maybe even Democrats?
I think, yes, it'll be a populist versus non-populist war in the party. And I think Trump has already increased the number of college-educated white independents. But let me turn to the panel to give us the final judgment on this in our remaining minute and a half or so. Who wants to speak up? Don't make me call on somebody.
Oh, I was going to say that based on disaffected Republicans that I know, they are eagerly awaiting a chance for what they call their party to come alive again. And so I think that they are waiting for Trump to be no longer the play caller. Whether or not they can resurrect that, I really don't know. That other minds might have an insight into that. But I know there are those people who, for now, have walked away from the Republican Party because they don't want to be affiliated with such vitriol. But they're not independents. They're in this sort of netherworld. So I think something will happen. I'm not sure what it is.
Do either of you want to weigh in on this briefly?
The only thing I agree with what Lisa has said. I mean, and I certainly agree with Mike that it will be valuable for America for the Republican Party to have this civil war and decide what it wants to stand for and therefore what kind of candidates it wants to stand for. I'm of two minds of what happens after Trump. The first is that Donald Trump catalyzed this group of voters, many of whom had never voted before. I mean, he really did get a lot of vote out. And in fact, you don't have to just look at the results in 2018 and 2022 versus 2020, when the Trump base came out, but they didn't come out in 2018 and 2022. And so the Republicans didn't do as well as they were supposed to do either time. So I think there's that. But I also think there's that the problem that the failure the Democrats have had is when you had Democratic moderates or whatever, or conservatives who didn't like the Democratic nominee, be it George McGovern, later Walter Mondale and the rest, the Republicans did a great job of saying to those people, organizing Democrats for Nixon in 1972 and organizing people to vote for Reagan in 84. You had none of that with Trump. You had people who basically took a sabbatical from being a Republican and voted for their sister or their brother. And that's a failure of the Democrats, that they didn't figure out there are these people who are offended by this guy and we should be able to steal him. And they didn't figure out how to do that.
Sarah, final word?
Yeah, final word. I think we can look to the state of California for the future of the GOP. Much of the research on what propelled Donald Trump and MAGA-style Republicanism is about racial resentment. And that's not the only thing that propelled support for Trump, but certainly it existed. But the future of America looks quite different. And here in California, if we take a look at the Republicans who are being elected to Congress, there are Latinos, there are Asian Americans. If we look in Texas and other places, there are African-American Republicans. And that sentiment of racial resentment combined with the actual demographic shifts that are happening. And as we've seen, there are small but steady contingents of both Black voters and Latino voters that are shifting towards MAGA-style Republicanism. There will be a day of reckoning in which the MAGA Republican coalition is going to have to deal with their thoughts on race in America, and hopefully learn to accept the changing demographics and accept folks as members of their party.
Okay, Mike and I want to thank Sara, Arnon, who's half a world away, Lisa, and the ever elusive Linda for a terrific panel. And I want to thank our audience for joining us today. All of you have a great weekend in the next few days. Take care. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.